Program, B.S. English. Course, Literary Criticism. Topic, Coleridge on Fancy and Imagination. Prepared by, Dr. Shahryar Khan. Question. What are Coleridge's views on imagination? What are its kinds? How is it different from fancy? Discuss in detail with reference to Coleridge's biography Literaria. Introduction. Before the 18th century, both fancy and imagination were used in the context of fairytale. Most of the times, scholars would use these two terms synonymously. In the neoclassical age, the use of the term fancy declined and imagination gained a higher status in the discussions of art and literature. Though Wordsworth has also written on imagination, but his discussion is limited to the use of imagination in poetry. In Biographia Literaria, Coleridge has formulated his own theory of imagination. He is the first English critic who studied the nature of imagination and examined its role in creative activity. Coleridge has expanded the discussion on imagination by making a distinction between primary and secondary imagination and then differentiating them from fancy. T.S. Eliot has commented, Coleridge was perhaps the greatest of English critics, and his greatest contribution was the attempt to define the process of poetic creation. The distinction between fancy and imagination is a distinction of the highest importance. Point 1. In chapter 13 of his Biographia Literaria, Coleridge writes that imagination is of two kinds, primary and secondary. Primary imagination is the faculty of perception. It is merely the power of receiving perceptions of the external world through the senses. It is an involuntary act of the mind, i.e., we receive sense data from our surroundings consistently and unconsciously. The mind imposes some sort of order on these impressions. It arranges them in categories based on previous knowledge. In this way, the mind is able to form a clear image of the outside world. The primary imagination is not just the faculty of a poet or an artist. It is universal and possessed by all. Point 2. Secondary imagination is not universal. It is the faculty of an artist or a poet. It is the secondary imagination that makes possible any artistic creation. Unlike primary imagination, it is not involuntary. It involves conscious effort. Its raw material is the sense data received through primary imagination. Secondary imagination rearranges the sense data, reshapes and remodels it and turns it into objects of beauty. Coleridge calls secondary imagination esemplastic, that is, it has the power to unify disparate things into one whole. Coleridge says that secondary imagination reshapes the objects of the external world and steeps them with the glory and dream that never was on sea and land. It is an active agent that dissolves, diffuse, dissipates, in order to create. Secondary imagination is at the root of all poetic activity. It is the faculty that reconciles opposites. It blends together the inner qualities of man like perception, intellect, emotion. Moreover, it unifies these inner qualities with the external world. In this way, it bridges the subjective with the objective. Point 3. On the other hand, fancy is a different activity. Fancy is not a creative power. Primary imagination receives data from the external world. Fancy combines this external data into beautiful shapes, but it does not unify it. The difference between the two is the same as the difference between a mechanical mixture and a chemical compound. In a mechanical mixture, two different elements are brought together. They are mixed up, but they do not lose their individual properties. They still have their separate identities. On the other hand, in a chemical compound, different ingredients combine to form something new. They do not have their separate identities. They lose their identities to transform into something different. A compound is an act of creation while a mixture is just bringing together different elements. Coleridge says, fancy is not creative. It is a kind of memory. It arbitrarily brings together images, and even when brought together, they continue to retain their separate and individual properties. Point 4. In order to illustrate the difference between fancy and imagination, Coleridge has quoted two excerpts from Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis. The first passage, according to Coleridge, is an example of fancy. Full gently now she takes him by the hand. A lily prisoned in a goal of snow, or ivory in an alabaster band. So while a friend engirds so white a foe. In these lines, the images maintain their separate identities and do not fuse into one another. The following lines, on the other hand, are an example of secondary imagination. Look! How a bright star shooteth from the sky. So glides he in the night from Venus' eye. In these lines, the poet has brought together many images and feelings. The lines fuse the beauty of Adonis, the rapidity of the flight, the desire and helplessness of Venus all in one whole. The images and perceptions are dissolved together to create a completely new impression. Conclusion. To conclude, we can say that Coleridge deems imagination a higher faculty than fancy. He divides imagination into primary and secondary. The difference between these two is not that of kind but of degree. The secondary imagination is more conscious and more creative. On the other hand, primary imagination is universal and involuntary. It just collects data from the external world. It is the secondary imagination that is the source of all creative activity. Fancy is a different kind of activity. It is a kind of memory that can bring together different images and perceptions. These images and perceptions keep their separate identities and do not fuse together to form new whole. I. A. Richards has commented upon the significance of Coleridge's contribution in these words. Coleridge's work on the imagination was a new beginning in the study of the mind. He was the first to realize that the mind is not a passive mirror of the world, but a creative agent.